divided America. This is in the context of not only the horrific scenes of this Ukrainian refugee, Irina Zarutska, coming out of North Carolina, but of course, murder of Charlie Kirk. But actually, what's been most striking is the response to them.
You support Charlie Kirk being killed?
Yes, I do.
Charlie Kirk got shot and he's dead!
It's not just on social media and Congress.
The House will be in order.
How divided is America right now?
Based on everything that I've seen, we're probably the most divided politically that we've ever been.
We're in a time where it's not just about disagreeing about what the solutions are to our problems. We don't even agree on what reality is.
People are not so much voting because they like their own party, it's because they hate the other party. And hatred is it's a dangerous emotion.
So how is it that America came to hate the other within it?
But that is where hate inevitably will lead. Assassination culture seems to be rising, particularly on the political left. When you ask people directly, would it be potentially justified to assassinate high-profile political figures like Trump or Musk? And more than 50% of people who identified as left of center said that, we're going down a very, very dark path here.
Before you hear from Rob Henderson, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Rob exploring the issues you want to hear about that the corporate media just won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, not only will you enjoy ad-free viewing and listening, but you can hear an extended conversation between me and Rob, where Rob tells me about his recent meetings with the late Charlie Kirk. But without further ado, Rob Henderson. Rob Henderson, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come speak with me. You are the publisher of a phenomenal Substack, which just sort of glistens and glitters with facts and insight about the state of the world, the state of America, and it's just utterly fascinating. And of course, an author, a writer, and a great thinker, I think, of the times that we're going through. And so what I was hoping to talk to you about was divided America. And this is in the context of not only the horrific scenes of this Ukrainian refugee, Irina Zarutska, coming out of North Carolina, but of course the horrible, terrible murder of Charlie Kirk. And of course we could look at sort of maybe what are the reasons that led us to those situations, but actually what's been most striking is the response to them, and particularly those of us who are on social media following. It's a very split response. It's not just on social media. In Congress, we saw people from the Democrats calling out not to have a moment's silence for Charlie Kirk. So it's in the political realms, it seems to me, a great division. And this split seems to be ideological, it seems to be geographic to some extent. In your work, you look at personality stuff, which I'm hoping, and psychology, we're hoping we can get into today. It also seems to me that we're in a time where it's not just about disagreeing about what the solutions are to our problems. We don't even agree on what reality is a little bit. Mm-hmm. So if I can start with a broad question, how divided is America right now?
Well, based on everything that I've seen, we're probably the most divided politically that we've ever been. If you look at the research in political science, political psychology, sort of tracing sort of feelings toward one's own party versus the opposing party, historically, Americans have felt more positive regard for their own party as compared to negative feelings toward the opposing party. So if you're a Democrat, you like the Democrats more than you hate the Republicans, and vice versa. That's historically how things have been. But within the last decade or so, that has flipped, where people are not so much voting because they like their own party. It's because they hate the other party. And hatred is it's a dangerous emotion. You'd mentioned personality, and I've studied psychology in depth. I have a PhD in social psychology, and one of the interesting findings on the research on emotions is that there is a distinction between anger and hatred. So a lot of people will talk about political anger right now. And anger is an evolved emotion. Essentially, the function of it is to bargain for better treatment. So if you anger me, I will behave in a certain way in order to attempt to recalibrate how you treat me, inflicting costs or withholding benefits. That's typically how anger is expressed, through verbal confrontation or through hostility, that kind of thing. Or I can just stop speaking with you, give you the silent treatment, and withhold benefits in that way. And that's how anger is. Anger is about trying to navigate a relationship, but hatred is different from anger. Hatred is the desire for the object of your hatred to cease to exist. It's you. I believe you are so toxic and that you're imposing so many costs on me that it would be better for you to cease to exist altogether. That's different from anger, which is I'm going to treat you a certain way so that you'll treat me better. That's what anger is. Hatred is you shouldn't exist. And I think we're seeing a lot of this kind of political hatred now, where we believe we can no longer communicate, expressing anger doesn't seem to work, and now this is moving to a point of hatred. And I think this, at least in part, explains why we're seeing a rise in political violence.
So how is it that America came to hate itself, or it's the other within it?
Yeah, there are some interesting competing explanations for this. So one is the lack of a common enemy. So some social scientists have suggested that part of the reason why America was relatively cohesive in the latter half of the 20th century was the Cold War. That regardless of your political stance, if you were liberal or conservative or what have you, we could all kind of agree that the Soviet Union was an enemy. The way that they treated their people was despicable. And so we had that sort of overarching superordinate identity. We're all Americans. And then following 9/11, people across the political aisle saw the threat from radical Islam, and there was this kind of fear that permeated the country. And so that may have brought us all together, this feeling of patriotic fervor in the wake of that event. But, in the last 10, 15 years or so, we haven't had a common enemy in that same way. And so we're starting to look inward at ourselves and our neighbors and the people we're around. And politics seems to have replaced that feeling of, who's the enemy, who's the outgroup, who can I compare myself against and think of myself as better than. And I think now it's, whether you're on the left or on the right.
It's strange, isn't it? Because for a moment when COVID came along, I thought, this might be the unifying thing. We'd just come out the back in my country of Brexit. Here in the States, we'd seen volatile politics with Trump. And I thought, maybe COVID will be, a national pandemic, an international, worldwide pandemic might be the thing that unites everyone. But it didn't pan out to be that way, exactly. Just before we explore further the whys, I wonder if you could actually give me evidence that America does actually hate the other. Like, it's very easy if you look at social media. If you just to take that sample pool, would be like, yeah, obviously. But social media is a small percentage of, or certainly Twitter is, or X is a small percentage of the whole country. What evidence do you have that it's actually true that America is not just angry with its other half, but hateful of its other half?
Yeah. Well, so that was more speculative. The findings on what's called the feelings thermometer in the political psychology research, that does seem to be empirically validated, that people hate or dislike or hate the opposing party more than they like their own party. Now, whether that sort of feeling of the desire to extinguish the other party has been rising, I don't know. But that is where hate inevitably will lead. You also see interesting research on support for political violence and assassinations and this kind of thing increasing. There was this interesting piece in City Journal a few weeks ago on, this was in the wake of the Luigi Mangione killing, the United Healthcare CEO, of what's called assassination culture. And it seems to be rising, particularly on the political left. When you ask people directly, would it be potentially justified to assassinate high-profile political figures like Trump or Musk? And more than 50% of people who identified as left of center said that, potentially in some cases, this might be justified. And so, of course, this will never only run in one direction. There will be the desire to retaliate, and I think one job of people, high-profile people across the political spectrum, is to attempt to contain that violence. But you have people like, was it Elizabeth Warren, after that CEO was shot? She said something like, you can only push people so far. That kind of rhetoric. There was that reporter who I believe was penalized in some way by his employer, the reporter on MSNBC, who said, you can only say things for so long before people start to take action. And, it's not even empirically wrong. If you say things that upset people, you are risking an increase in the possibility of violence against you. But you shouldn't ratify that and support it and encourage it and attempt to make it into a reasonable act. It should be condemned. It's, yes, those feelings can be reasonable. If someone says something that upsets you and you want to react physically, that can be a normal feeling, but you shouldn't do it. That is the next sentence that people should say, but they're not saying that. And so I think this is, we're going down a very, very dark path here.
So you say that this is more noticeable on the left, but we're not actually necessarily talking about real crimes and violence that's taken place. I'd like to explore that, but let's put that aside for one moment. Specifically, the sentiment that's changed. So you've got empirical evidence that rather than on the right, on the left, there is an increasing sentiment that violence is acceptable, increasingly so. That you're saying is the case. So
yes, yeah. But the difference is not stark. On the right, you do see, especially on the extreme right, and this is. So what I would say is that the average sentiment on the left is that potentially violence can be justified. There's this language about authoritarian takeovers and so on. Whereas I would say the average member of the political right is less interested in using political violence. But the extreme segment of the right is particularly dangerous, possibly even more dangerous than the extreme left. And so there's this interesting thing here where on the political left, there's kind of a certain level of feelings of animosity, support for violence, and so on. On the right, less so, but then on the extreme right, that is an especially sort of dangerous faction. That is something to keep in mind. I think that there's this interesting asymmetry on the right and the left with regard to violence.
So with regards to the carrying out of violence, I can certainly see a hell of a lot of it coming from the left, but that might be because of the bubble I'm in. But certainly, we've had Andy Ngo on the show. He covered the many killings and violence after the George Floyd death in 2020, and I think it was 19 killed in the first 14 days, 25 by the end of October. And already this year, there was the 2 people in D.C. killed by a Palestinian activist. We've got what has happened, of course, to Charlie Kirk. But there are definitely incidences on the other side. There's 2 Minnesota representatives in June that were killed, Democrat representatives. So it is the case that there's violence happening on both sides. Do you think that it's... I hate to do both sidesism. I hate to play that game. But what's your take on the differences between actual acts that are happening?
Well, yeah, it kind of... so the killings that you'd mentioned that were committed by the right on those Democratic lawmakers, those are politicians, and it does seem to be inspired by some kind of, probably disorganized political rage at them. Whereas in contrast, the killings that you'd mentioned, toward Charlie Kirk, who as of this conversation, the shooter hasn't been identified. But it seems to be more diffuse. It's not just aimed at political figures, but toward anyone who's promoting sort of right of center viewpoints, where it's not just people who are expressing those views need to be silenced in some way. Whereas on the right, it seems more like people who are trying to enact left-wing policies. Those are the people who are the threat, but not so much sort of people who support those views. So it is different, I think. I was just sent a screenshot from a friend of mine who is a Republican, and it was from a left-leaning friend of his. And it was something like, the next time you go to CPAC, I hope the place is bombed, because the world would, he said something like, I hope it's bombed. I hope you survive, but the world would be better if those people didn't exist. And that goes to this idea of hatred, of you want to extinguish their existence. And my friend texted back, like, don't say that to me. Like, why would you say that? But I think that is a growing sentiment on the left, is that Trump and his supporters are a uniquely dangerous threat. And, that if you truly, this is the classic thing that's been discussed since 2016, is if you think Hitler is coming to power, is it okay to take out Hitler and his supporters? And I think a lot of people are, they still have that thought in their mind.
So you point to how things have changed since the Cold War gave Americans a common enemy. The obvious thing that jumps to mind is social media exacerbating things. But if you take the sort of post-Cold War period, how do you understand the history of this? How is it that America have evolved to this place that you've just described?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people have pinpointed social media as a possible explanation. And I've heard some interesting competing views on this. So on the one hand, I think for a while people thought that the echo chamber problem was the real issue, that you're only seeing your own opinions reflected back at you, your views harden, you're not exposed to viewpoints from the other side. And that this may be sort of fueling the polarization. But on the other hand, I've also seen some interesting research suggesting that maybe the opposite is true, that before social media, you would spend most of your time with people like yourself. So the echo chambers always existed, even before social media. Most of your friends, your family, the social circles you hang out with, they have the same political views as you. Social media actually introduced you to the other side. And often what it does is introduce you to the most extreme elements of the other side, because the people who post on social media, they tend to be more politically engaged. They tend to be more hardened in their views. And this is a classic finding for Twitter users. Something like 2% of Twitter users post 80% of the tweets. And this is kind of a classic heuristic in social media, the 1% rule of social media, which is that 1% of the population posts the majority of the content online. 9% will engage with it in some way. They'll comment, they'll like, they'll retweet. And the remaining 90% are just lurkers, where they don't really post anything at all. So you actually you're not exposed to the majority of the views on your side or the other on social media. You're exposed to a small percentage of the population that is very politically active, that's often very angry. They tend to score high on what are known as the dark triad personality traits. And that's what we're exposed to. And we think that that is the typical person on the other side, right? So if you open social media and you see people cheering the death of Charlie Kirk or something on the political left, and you think, oh, that's what the left is. Well, no, that's 1% or 2% of the left that are posting those things. And then maybe 9% that are liking and retweeting those things. But the majority of people are not on social media and they're not engaging with it at all.
Yes, that distribution is the classic Pareto distribution.
Exactly.
Can you unpack for me the dark triad? I've also heard dark tetrad. What does that mean exactly?
So the dark triad, it's a framework in personality psychology, and it encompasses 3 distinct personality traits. So you have narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And so narcissism, a lot of your listeners will be familiar with narcissism, this kind of self-entitled view of the world, being self-important, grandiose, and then psychopathy, which is cruelty or callousness, disregard for other people. And finally, Machiavellianism, which is strategic exploitation and duplicity, this feeling that the ends justify the means, that manipulation is okay if it allows you to get what you want. And then the dark tetrad. So this is a proposed fourth additional trait, although there's still some debate among personality psychologists about this. But the fourth trait, dark tetrad, that trait is sadism, which is positive delight in the suffering of others. Which is distinct from psychopathy. So psychopathy is, I don't care what happens to you. If I have to mow you down to get what I want, fine. If not, that's fine too. Sadism is mowing you down is the point. That's how I receive gratification. And so, there's something like 1 to 5% of the population, depending on the measures you use, have elevated traits, elevated dark triad traits, and they disproportionately account for so much of the misconduct and bad behavior that we see in the real world in terms of violence, actual physical violence and crimes and so on, but then also in sort of more everyday transgressions, manipulation and betrayal and subversiveness and that kind of thing. And then online, there's been some interesting work comparing Twitter users to Facebook users. You have to have a kind of a reference point, a control group, and so they used Facebook as like the normie social media user. And Twitter users score higher on the dark triad traits than Facebook users do.
Yeah. How accepted is the dark triad, dark tetrad theory amongst scientists or
among personality psychologists?
Yeah.
I mean, there's always going to be a bit of debate with everything, but this is more or less an agreed upon framework among personality psychologists that if you compare the average person in society with someone who has elevated dark triad traits, you're going to notice distinct differences, and you're going to be able to predict how the person with those elevated traits will behave compared to the average person. And it's important here, I suppose, also to point out that the dark triad, these are what are known as subclinical traits. So if you score high in dark triad narcissism, that doesn't necessarily mean you would qualify for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. These measures are meant to understand the average member of society, the average population. So it's a distribution, it's a bell curve where most of us, if we take the dark triad scales, will fall somewhere in the middle. But if someone scores in that sort of far right tail of the bell curve, that is someone who maybe you would want to avoid.
Why does X reward those people with those traits?
Well, negativity is naturally attention drawing. So if I tweet something that's neutral or positive, it doesn't seem to capture people's attention in the same way as if I were to post something that is provocative or shocking or negative or insulting in some way. And that's just how our brains are wired, is that we pay much more attention to negative information than positive information, because negative information could potentially be threatening. It could lead to loss of life or injury and so on, whereas positive information, well, it's nice to have, but it's not life-threatening in that same way. And so we pay attention to the negative. And then when if you're a dark triad-oriented person and you already kind of have a cynical, negative outlook and you post those things, the algorithm will reward you. So I know a lot of people want to blame the algorithm, but the algorithm kind of just reflects human psychology. If positivity spread, if we were naturally drawn to positive messages, then the algorithm would sense that and start to feed us more positive stuff. But we already are drawn to the negative, and then the algorithm, which I guess there's some responsibility for it, it reinforces it and shows us more of that kind of content.
We've evolved to have to pay attention to the negative, even if it's a false negative for evolutionary purposes, for survival.
Yes. Yeah. And it exploits that in the same way that, I don't know, fast food will exploit your desire for, junk food, right? It'll show the images and there's a distinctive smell, and, they know how to exploit those features of our psychology. And social media does kind of the same thing with keeping the messages short, right? There's the character limit. I mean, I know Twitter, you can expand it, but the shorter messages tend to get more attention. And, the fact that you have to click see more means that you're incentivized to keep your message short and sweet and stripped of all nuance. And that is, what tends to go viral.
Are dark tetrad and dark triad types evenly split on the political left and right?
That's an interesting question. So I don't know of any empirical work on whether there is a difference. I would be surprised if there were a difference. I would expect that it's probably roughly the same, where you'll see kind of that 1% to 5% on the left and on the right as well. But regardless of political orientation, people high on the dark triad are, very similar. You see this with support for different forms of authoritarianism. So people who are high on the dark triad, and they tend to be on the right, they support right-wing authoritarianism. And then people who are high on the dark triad on the political left support versions of left-wing authoritarianism, seizing control of the state in order to achieve some notion of social justice or equity, even if this means coercive redistribution or imprisoning enemies of your ideology. And it's the same on the right as well. So you see this. Interestingly, on the dark triad thing, there was a paper a couple of years ago which found that people who are anti-natalist tend to have elevated dark triad traits. So people who believe that it's wrong to have children tend to score higher on all three traits. All three traits, yeah. And
why would that be?
So there are, so it was just one paper. I would like to see it replicated, but one possibility for why people high on the dark triad are more anti-natalist than average is it could be a kind of, it's known as like a reproductive interference strategy or a mating interference strategy, where if I can convince you or manipulate you into not having children, then that will lead to more opportunities and resources for my own offspring. And so you support this ideology and undermine other people's reproductive fitness in order to enhance your own. And I don't think this is conscious, by the way. I don't think people are necessarily consciously thinking this out. But, the way evolution works is it doesn't care what your intentions are. It cares about the outcomes. Do you have more descendants? Is your survival and reproduction enhanced or not, regardless of what's actually going on up here? And so, this is it is a fascinating finding. And what I would like to see in a follow-up study is whether people on those traits tend to have more or fewer children themselves. They're anti-natalist for everyone else. Are they anti-natalist in terms of their own behavior? Because there's other work showing that people who are high on the dark triad traits tend to favor short-term mating strategies, which means they are generally uninterested in commitment and monogamy, and they enjoy sleeping around and having lots of different partners. They tend to have an orientation toward novelty seeking, one-night stands, hookups, that kind of thing. And there's some interesting work here suggesting that they might have so they have more sexual partners than average, but do they have more children than average? In the modern world, probably not. But that mating style in the ancestral environment would lead to more children.
Do you think there's a psychological difference between those who vote for the political left and those who vote for the political right? And I say that in the context of, I remember reading Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, and he talks about moral foundations theory. And he does say that there's a sort of split in psychology in people's, if not their party politics, their ideologies, and where they have a propensity to go a different way. But I always found that weird, because if you look at voting patterns in America, it is quite geographical and regional. And if it's geographical and regional, wouldn't we expect a psychological split in each region to have a kind of distribution that all psychologies are represented. I don't know if I've articulated that very well, but perhaps we'll go to the first question. The original question is there a psychological split between right-leaning and left-leaning people?
Yes, there are some interesting differences in terms of personality traits. So if you look at what personality psychologists call the big five personality traits, so openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So if you take a personality test, you'll get a score on each of those dimensions. And when you gather info about people's political orientation, you'll find that on average, liberals tend to score higher in openness. So this is, again, interest in novelty, new ideas, new experiences, creativity. So artists tend to score higher on openness. People who are interested in travel, people who are high in openness tend to have more tattoos and piercings, more interested in kind of unconventional styles and ways of thinking. And liberals also tend to score higher on neuroticism as well. And this is sensitivity to negative emotion, minor frustration in response to setbacks and that kind of thing. Whereas conservatives tend to score higher on a trait of conscientiousness, which is hard work, orderliness, focus, diligence, that kind of thing. And there was a really interesting survey out of YouGov and Cato a few years ago, which gave people a forced choice question, which is, what do you think is more important in life? Is it to do things that give you pleasure and satisfaction, or is it to work hard and do what is expected of you? And as you might expect, people who were liberal said that the first option is more important in life, is to do things that give you pleasure and satisfaction. And conservatives are more likely to say, given those two options, that working hard and doing what's expected of you is more important. So there are these distinct differences and preferences between the two sides. And I think, this can go a long way to explaining some of the political divide. And I think this is also fueling we're seeing in terms of gender polarization as well in politics, that men are leaning more right, women are leaning more left. And the polarization along gender lines, I think, can also be explained by personality, but also the fact that people aren't partnering up anymore.
We're definitely going to come back to the gender divide. Sure. Let me just come back to my point about Jonathan Haidt. So I'll rephrase it. Should we expect these differences in personality types to be evenly spread across a nation?
Oh, I see. So you're saying that, okay, so you have, this is a red state.
This is a red state, this is a blue state. Yeah. But if humans have, if it's even a variation in different personality, why would it end up that there are red states and blue states?
Yeah, that's well. Okay, so it's also important to remember that within those red states and blue states, it's not as if Texas is 100% Republican and California is 100% Democrat. So California is actually something like 40% of the registered voters are Republicans. So it's still 60% Democrat, but it's not overwhelming, right? And I would imagine Texas is probably something like the reverse. And so politics is not a kind of natural kind in the mind, the way that personality is. So if you go back to like the 1980s, for example, when Reagan won like 49 states, it's not as if every single American had the exact same personality traits in 1984, and they were all, kind of red-blooded Republicans or something. So people's personality traits tend to endure over time, but politics is more adaptable and changes with the moment. And often when you collect data on people's self-identified political orientation, it doesn't necessarily match with how they vote either. So, for example, the amount of young men who identify as liberal or conservative, it actually hasn't changed all that much. There's a slight uptick in terms of self-identified conservatives, but not very much. And yet there was this huge shift among young men in 2024 voting for Trump. Those guys didn't necessarily think of themselves or identify as conservatives, but they were more responding to what they viewed as progressive overreach, the excesses of the left. So they didn't think, I'm a conservative Republican. They're thinking, well, I don't know, but I like Trump more than the other person, so I'll just go for Trump. So I think that also helps to explain some of this as well.
So you've written about the gender divide, the gender paradox, and as you just painted a picture there. Men seem to be going more to the right and women going to the left. And I'm not entirely convinced by that, by the way, because there's other studies I've seen that suggest men aren't actually going further to the right, but it's women are going further to the left. And so it appears as if men are going further to the right because of this increasing divide. Have I got that right or wrong?
Yeah. So it's so the fact that young women have veered to the left, that is, I've never seen anything refuting that. That seems to be well validated. Men going to the right, young men, so we're talking kind of under 30, that one is more mixed, where some surveys do show a slight shift to the right. Others surveys show no shift at all. But it is the case, because we have the voter data, that they did, at least in terms of how they voted, a lot of young men did shift toward Trump, whether or not they personally identify as conservative or not.
Is it abnormal in greater history for men and women to vote differently? We might feel like it's different in our lifetime, but through history, is that a peculiarity?
Well, it's interesting. So, if you spend a lot of time in more right-leaning circles, they'll talk about how women are naturally liberal or naturally progressive or something like that. But this doesn't seem to be the case. Up until the 1980s, women were actually more likely to identify as conservative and more likely to identify as Republican than men were. Men were actually more likely to be Democrats up until the 80s. And then starting in the 90s, that's when the reversal occurred, where men started to lean more conservative and women started to lean more liberal. And I still don't know exactly what happened there. Why this is the case. Could be the end of the Cold War. It could be it could be marriage. Women, the majority of women, under 30 women, used to be married in the 80s and 90s, and then that's kind of the era where things started to shift in the opposite direction. The characteristics of the parties were different as well, where I think Democrats and Republicans, the sort of leadership on the parties were not so very different. And possibly if you were a working aged young male, you might have favored a bit more sort of bigger government, maybe more of a safety net, because you had so much more of a financial burden on your shoulders. Whereas that's less true today for young men, where you're not necessarily expected to provide for a family because, well, fewer families are being formed in the first place. And the Republicans have historically been kind of the party of strength and protection and this kind of thing. And maybe that appealed to, wives and mothers. This is speculation here for one possibility for why this occurred. Whereas today it's very much, you mentioned the gender equality paradox, where now women are veering very sharply to the left. And people have been asking, why is this the case? And
women or young women?
Young women. Well, women in general, but
even married women.
No. Single women, especially young women under 30, but across the board, married women might be an exception, but otherwise, women are tilting to the left regardless of their age. But the shift is most pronounced among under 30. Relative to under 30 men. And you're seeing this across developed first world countries. There was that famous image from the Financial Times of the US, Germany, the UK, Japan, so on, all these countries where the gender split is occurring. And
South Korea as well.
Oh, right, South Korea.
The anomaly is Singapore, which seems to be had an inversion where it's men are getting more liberal and women are more conservative. But
interesting.
We'll come back to that anomaly. Can I just rewind one moment just to why it is that marriage makes a difference? Now, I would speculate or guess the answer being that if you have children, you should want to protect your children. So you have a mother would have a protective instinct. And so a conservative government or conservative politics that are pro-protection, that's what they want. And so as you implied, so the 80s and 90s, the age for marriage increases, then there's more single women who don't have that mother instinct for protection. Have I does that make sense, or have I got that completely wrong?
No, that's interesting. I mean, that may be why. I think also, yes, you turn more inward than outward when you have a family, right? Like now you have these people around you who rely on you, who depend on you, and even men who, start out as a bit more conservative nowadays than women, they become more so after they get married. So everyone kind of becomes more conservative after they get married, and then even more so once they have children. So there's kind of two-step process there. And so, well, why does this happen? So I think one is what you're describing, turning inward and taking care of the people around you rather than looking outward and thinking, how can I change the world? It becomes, how do I make sure my kid has a good life, and setting the kid up for success. And then I think also, men and women tend to have a tendency to depolarize one another. When you enter a relationship and you start out with slightly different political views, but then you tend to kind of adjust over time. Men do a little bit of adjusting, but I think women in a relationship tend to do more, in terms of women are more likely to adopt the political views of their male partner than vice versa. Which isn't to say that men are also, they're affected as well, where they might become a bit more liberal in some sense. But women tend to be even more sort of turning toward that conservative orientation.
Is there any indication that this divide is affecting men and women relationships? And are Republicans and Democrats dating more or less or the same as beforehand?
This actually connects to our earlier discussion about the growing divide, feelings of animosity toward the political outgroup. So in the 1960s, if you asked Americans, is it okay for your child to marry someone of a different race? The overwhelming majority, some 80 to 90%, said no. But when you ask them, is it okay for your child to marry someone of the opposing political party, the majority said yes. More than 50% said that would be fine. Today, it's the reverse, where if you ask Americans, is it okay for your child to marry someone of a different race, the overwhelming majority, 90% plus, say that's fine. But if you ask, is it okay for your child to marry someone of the opposing political party, more than 50% say no way. They would really not like that. And so our feelings of hostility and confrontation and anger, it's been redirected away from racism, which is a good thing, but it's not a good thing that we still are seeing it channeled in this other way. And you're seeing this now with and this again, this seems to be more so coming from the left, probably because for interesting evolutionary psychology reasons, where if you ask conservatives, would you date a liberal? They're more likely to say yes than if you ask liberals, would you date a conservative? Now, most people generally would prefer to date someone of their own political party, but if you just ask them point blank, would you be open to dating someone of the opposing party? Conservatives are more open to it than liberals. And my suspicion for why this is the case is that there are more women who identify as liberals, and women tend to be more choosy with who they date. They want someone who shares their values and so on. But this gets tricky because the very traits that make men attractive to women tend to be more conservative coded. So being self-sufficient and financially successful and ambitious and all those kinds of things, those aren't necessarily coded as left-leaning. And so I saw this funny tweet a few months ago. It was something like, it was from a woman. She said something like, I want a man who looks like a conservative but votes like a liberal.
Wow. So what does this mean then for the future? Like, is this in terms of the male-female relations? Do you think things are trending further away? Can they be reconciled?
Can they be reconciled? Yes, but I don't know exactly how it would be. How to chart a path to more unity. I'm hoping that people will see these horrific attacks on public figures and recognize that if we keep going in this direction, things will escalate. And it would be, I think if public figures on both sides, people who have influence and reach and people whose side will listen to them, if they reiterate that this period of peace and stability and calm and, freedom of speech, using speech rather than violence, this is historically anomalous, that actually, historically, when you say something that challenges other people's opposing views, that violence will result, that was a common response. And that using words instead, debate, dialogue, kind of verbal jousting rather than actual physical jousting, that's very precious and sensitive, and it's vulnerable. It's a vulnerable principle that we have to constantly reaffirm. And I mean, what's funny is that historically, even if you didn't necessarily challenge the opposing view, but you accepted that it was open for debate, even, this could backfire on you. There's a story of René Descartes, the French philosopher. His books were banned by the Catholic Church, which might seem odd because his books contained powerful arguments for the existence of God. He was a believer himself, and he had his formal logical proofs for why God exists. The church banned them anyway because Descartes treated that as an open question. The fact that you would even think to question whether God exists, the fact that he would even require arguments suggests that maybe your mind isn't in the right place, and we wouldn't want to expose people to those questions in the first place. And so, despite the fact that he was on the correct side of the argument, his books were banned anyway.
We've talked about the psychological differences between right and left. What are the ideological, or the most ideological differences? Beyond just party politics, beyond just conservatism or liberalism, what are the issues that are really splitting?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think the number one issue that comes to mind is immigration, that this has been an ongoing battle between the left and the right for a while. And now you're seeing what looks like an overcorrection, where first there was this overreach on the left under Biden, where I'm sure many of your listeners have seen those shocking charts indicating a massive rise in illegal immigration during those years of 2021 to 2020.
Something like 10 million.
And yeah, this is, no one can really give you accurate figures for how many undocumented people there are in the country. You'll see numbers as low as 10 or 12 million, and then some as high as 40 million. But the truth is, no one really knows. They're undocumented. And then Trump is going in the opposite direction, where there are, all these ICE and immigration raids and rounding people up. And so I think it's just hard either way to find that perfect middle ground. If we're going to deport these people, keep these people, no one's going to be satisfied here. But this has been quite clearly a raging debate for a while. There was a paper out of Europe just a few weeks ago, which found that, and this was interesting because it was more so a discussion of political elites versus ordinary voters. And political elites are consistently far more in favor of immigration than ordinary voters, regardless of political party. So even if you compare more left-wing elites to left-wing voters, the left-wing elites are more in favor of immigration and lax immigration policies and so on. And so, this is a clash here, I think, not just between left and right, but also between elites and the masses.
You've written a lot about elite ideas, and you are the coiner of the term luxury beliefs, which is, a brilliant idea. The idea that some ideas or beliefs, or you would advertise your own beliefs because they give you status, even though they don't actually correlate necessarily to reality, and they might even be costly to other. Have I defined this right? They're costly to other groups in society.
That's correct. Yeah, and what's funny is you could argue that even immigration, very lax immigration policy, could be a luxury belief because the people who support these policies. They themselves, their jobs are not as threatened. Typically, new arrivals, they're more likely to work in blue-collar, manual labor kind of jobs. And so they personally will be unaffected. In fact, they might even benefit, right? If they require, upkeep on their house and landscaping and maintenance and those kinds of things, that it can be nice for them to have cheap labor available to them. But there's been some interesting work indicating that when you ask, upper middle class, affluent people to imagine a scenario in which millions of highly qualified and credentialed immigrants from China or India, they speak English, they're educated, they're affluent, they're motivated, hardworking. Millions of them enter the country or want to enter the country. Would you support that? Then they tend to be more immigration restrictionist once it personally might threaten them.
I want to ask about one very specific thing of all these sort of luxury beliefs, although you might reject that it's a luxury belief.
Okay.
I've seen since October 7th, visiting here in New York, many pro-Palestine debates in London, protests, although some of them say they're pro-Palestine. I think that's putting it nicely. In my experience, before Israel even responded, was that people were celebrating on the streets in Britain. So I would say that there's elements, maybe big, maybe small, that are pro-Hamas. But I wondered whether that ideology, let's call it Palestinianism, or that Israel is an
anti-Zionism.
Anti-Zionism. Maybe that's a better way of framing it. Is anti-Zionism a luxury belief?
Interest. I mean, you are seeing it. I just, whenever I think of this, immediately my mind goes to all those Hamas encampments at elite colleges of people who are personally unaffected by what's happening in Israel and in Gaza and so on, and yet they think that they're doing something noble and righteous by skipping
class. And they get tremendous status from doing so. And by the way, just for clarity, this is a war started by Hamas. Mm-hmm. Hamas could end it at any moment if they hand over the hostages. Yeah. They surrender. But even if they handed over the hostages, that would be a start. And yet these people, I don't hear, they're not anti-Hamas protests. They're anti-Israel, anti-Zionist protests. So it seems to me that they're doing it and they're getting status from it.
Yeah. And they're, inflating the meaning of words like genocide, for example. I mean, there are Palestinian Arabs who live in Israel, and the Israeli government is not rounding them up and putting them on trains or something. They're not targeting them as an ethnic group. They were retaliating because this was an act of war. And, I have compared this to something like, if you go back to like 1944 and, the U.S. is firebombing Tokyo in response for Pearl Harbor, and then suddenly you have a bunch of Ivy League students saying the U.S. needs to stop their genocide against the Japanese, but that's not what was happening. There was no genocide. This was an act of war, and they're retaliating and, using very brutal means, but they didn't start that war, but they're trying to finish it and ensure that those attacks don't happen again. So, yeah, it's... I was just really horrified by what happened there, and then later with the Ivy League presidents and the president of MIT saying, calling for the genocide of Jews is, it's not against their policies. So this was late 2023. Yeah,
they called for the head of MIT.
So they were asked, this was a congressional hearing, they were asked, is calling for the genocide of Jews a violation of the speech policies at your university? And this was Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. And
Claudine Gay.
That's right, Claudine Gay. And I believe two of them lost their jobs.
But to be clear, she didn't call for the genocide of Jews.
They did not call, but they refused.
They refused. Yes,
yeah,
right.
They refused to say that it was it violated their speech policies, and they said, well, it depends on the context, and they equivocated and hemmed and hawed and so on. But a lot of people pointed out that if they were asked, what about calling for the genocide of blacks or calling for the genocide of Arabs or Palestinians for that matter, like would students who do that be penalized in some way? Because people were doing that, saying, calling for the genocide of Jews, but there was no response to it from the universities. So there is a double standard there. And this is that's an interesting kind of intra-left battle, I think, where people on the hard left are attempting to sort of push the moderate left more toward their side, or attempting to damage their reputations in some way.
Of the moderate left.
Of the moderate left, that's right. Yeah.
How would they be damaging the reputation?
Well, I think they're trying to say that they are traitors, or that they're supporting genocide, or that they're fascist in disguise, or they're really on the right, or that kind of thing.
It's been the case, evidently, for the last 10 years that the left are very purist.
Yeah.
And the very prominent members of the left, if they don't abide by leftist dogma, they get ostracized. J.K. Rowling is a classic example. She should be a darling of the left. The amount she's given for fantastic causes. I believe she's a woman of the left, a Labour supporter traditionally, although I managed to check that. And she has been villainized as some sort of modern day Hitler because she's a woman's rights activist. It's absolutely nuts.
She's a great example, because you see people on the right trying to claim her, and she's not on their side.
Yeah.
But the right has such at least at this moment, things could change, I know, but at this moment, the right does seem to have a bigger tent, and they're willing to take anyone who opposes the radical left, even if they themselves are not on the right. That they'll break bread with anyone, have conversations with anyone, and try to win people over, persuade them. Whereas on the extreme left, at least, there's no desire for that kind of open dialogue. It's shaming, stigma, reputation destruction, trying to purify their ranks.
So you've just written an article which I think gets to the root of this luxury beliefs concept, revolt of the rich kids. And you kind of bring it down to the real life experiences of a subset of Americans that have a lot of these luxury beliefs, who have actually been dealt a hand that they didn't realize they had. Let's put it that way. Now, perhaps I'm wrong to conflate that article with luxury beliefs, but perhaps we can start with your thesis in Revolt of the Rich Kids, if you wouldn't mind laying that out for me.
Sure. Yeah. So the Revolt of the Rich Kids, this was an article about downward mobility that I wrote for the Free Press. And this was something that I'd been thinking about for a while. I mean, really, I've been thinking about that idea ever since I set foot on Yale's campus in 2015 and witnessing, all the campus upheavals of the mid-2010s, of calling for professors to be fired and people being deplatformed and canceled and so on. And what I saw was just this very status anxious, aspirational elite who were objectively doing very well in their lives. If you go to a school like that, odds are you're never going to slip into any kind of serious poverty. So your life was okay. And yet I'd never seen so much anxiety about one's professional and financial prospects before. And then I came to realize, there's this fear, this great fear of downward mobility, where essentially the wealthier your parents are, the harder it is for you to replicate that level of wealth. If you have high achieving, ambitious, successful parents, and you're raised in that kind of comfort and affluence with all of the expectations that accompany that you want to do as well or better than your parents, right? That's kind of one definition I've heard of, like the American dream, doing better than your parents did. But for a lot of these young people, they feel like they can't do that. And when you look at the research statistics on downward mobility, it exists where if you look at the top richest fifth of households in the U.S., children born to the top fifth, about 10% of the children born into the top fifth will slide to the bottom fifth by midlife. So there is some churn. If you're born in the top, statistically, odds are you'll stay there, but there's a 10% chance that you'll slide all the way to the bottom. And so for a lot of these young people who are born into affluence, they're angry that they feel like their life isn't going in the direction that they'd hoped, that they may not be able to live the same life as their parents, that they feel as if their birthright has been denied them in some way. And then this expresses itself in radical politics, in what Peter Turchin calls intra-elite conflict. And so Turchin's idea is that when you have a surplus of elites and elite aspirants, so people who aspire to elite positions, you have a lot of young people who are highly educated, highly credentialed, highly ambitious, but there's still a limited number of seats of power, limited number of spots in elite firms, elite media outlets, in politics, in academia, and business, and so on. And you have a growing number of people competing for those spots, that this can give rise to resentment for the people who feel as if they're left out, for people who feel as if the system is inherently unfair because they did not get one of those coveted positions. And I think this is why, for example, Mamdani won the upper middle class vote in New York. If you look at, so this was for the New York mayoral primary. If you look at the voter breakdown by income category, Mamdani claimed to support the poor and working class of New York, but they did not vote for him. They did not support him. In fact, his base was primarily upper middle class young people with college degrees. That was Mamdani's base.
Okay.
Yeah. And I tie this in with this revolt of the rich kids idea, is that is the population I'm describing, these young people who fear slipping down the ladder, fear slipping down into a rung lower than they were born into. And so they want to support someone like Mamdani to upend the system in some way, or to punish those who they believe have done better than themselves.
So is it actually a luxury belief? That's maybe the wrong term in some sense, because they actually do want radical change. It's not a question of simply virtue signaling and saying, oh, this, that, and the other, trans rights, whatever. They actually want change because they're unhappy with where their classes, where they've ended up, and it's sort of a class issue, right?
There's a bit of a class issue here where, one of the things about status is that we always want more. This is an interesting finding here in the psychology literature, where when it comes to financial status, how much money you have, there does seem to be a point of diminishing returns, where once you reach a certain level of wealth, additional money doesn't really raise your satisfaction or happiness very much. But with status, symbolic capital, cultural capital, cachet, recognition, esteem, admiration, people always want more, no matter how much you have. And the people who are objectively already doing well in life tend to enjoy that kind of recognition and admiration and success, and they always want more of it. And they feel as if they're not getting enough. And, they tend to look upward at those who are getting those things, who are achieving levels of success, not just financially, but also in terms of cultural cachet and job titles and that kind of thing. And they're upset that it's why them and not me. And I think this is why historically socialism and socialist adjacent causes have always been disproportionately supported by highly educated people. You could think of them as something like second-tier elites, that they are doing objectively well relative to the average member of society, but they're angry that they're not. They're in the top kind of 10%, but not in the top 1%. And this was a classic essay by the Harvard political philosopher Robert Nozick. He had this famous essay, "Why Intellectuals Hate Capitalism," and he suggested that intellectuals generally they're not poor, they tend to be okay, middle class or above, but they're thinking, well, I'm smart, why am I not as rich as that businessman who's clearly not as intelligent as me?
Yeah, it's so interesting, because when exploring the idea of socialism and the motivations behind, or especially communism, because communism, it's so evil, and we've seen mountains of bodies and literally in the hundreds of millions, and yet it's a ideology that survives and carries on. And I've put it a little bit down to Cain and Abel in the Bible, this sort of jealousy, but it's not actually quite so simple, because actually the working classes, or the lower economic classes, aren't necessarily communist. And it's sort of, for example, in Britain, it's the let's say a Nigel Farage or right-wing parties are getting the vote of the indigenous lower British working classes. And the bulk of, let's say, Labour and the kind of progressive is coming from, not all, there's definitely regions where there's like a long socialist history of particularly in Britain, coming from factories and mining villages. So I'm not going to try and oversimplify it that much, but it seems to me that, and you see it in America, Trump, he was getting a lot of working class support, and it was the elites who hate him and it's the upper middle classes who hate him. So it's actually that them being the groups of people who are really close to power but don't actually have it that seem to support the ideology.
Yeah. There's a really nice line from a Financial Times columnist writing on this very point, where he says the person who's most likely to tear down a nation's establishment is a half member of it. So someone who's close enough to see its flaws, but far enough away to feel resentment that they're not in the inner circle. And I think this is, what you're seeing with, this revolt, this intra-elite conflict, that people who are doing well, but not as well as they would like, their outcomes did not meet their expectations. And then this kind of fuels a lot of the rage that we see. And this is a finding that Eric Hoffer points out. There's a classic book called The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements. And Eric Hoffer points out that often what fuels revolutions and civil wars and internal conflict is not immiseration or poverty or inequality. It's that people who are doing relatively well their conditions aren't improving as fast as they would like. And he points out to various revolutions, like the French Revolution, for example, where France, like the overall level of wealth was increasing in the run up to the French the French Revolution. Same thing with the Russian Revolution as well. That people were actually doing better than they had been, but conditions weren't improving fast enough for their liking, and so then they felt that they needed some kind of a formal conflict in order to accelerate the outcomes that they had desired. But so much of this is elite within elite.
Some of these leaders, Lenin, Guevara, Marx, I would probably say, they're coming from
intellectual,
this band of society.
Yeah, Marx's father was a businessman, and this is always the great danger. Is like you become a very successful person, and then you give your kid all the comforts, and then he becomes an anti-capitalist intellectual.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of a common pattern. But the story you mentioned, all the horrors of communism. If you look at communist leaders like Lenin, Pol Pot learned, so he was the communist dictator of Cambodia. He learned about Marxism and socialism as a student in Paris as a young man. So he came from a relatively affluent family. He got to study in Paris. He comes back to Cambodia with these new Western ideas of equality and dignity and so on. And then he turned the whole country into a graveyard. Something like a fourth of the country was massacred. And he targeted intellectuals. He targeted elites who he believed would be a threat to himself. So he would, for example, he and his soldiers would line people up against a wall, blindfold them, and speak French. And if anyone reacted, which indicated that they were educated and probably rich, he would have them shot. And of course, the irony here is that Pol Pot himself spoke French. And so, it's a lot of this is just elites angry at other elites, and then they try to exploit or camouflage themselves in the sentiments of the masses, that they're a person of the people, when really so much of their motivation is anger at people who they believe are doing better than themselves.
You mentioned, you write about this on your Substack, and you mentioned that in American schools, and I know this will apply to British schools, where kids are told relentlessly about the evils of Hitler, I would say rightly, very, very briefly about Stalin, if at all, and nothing on Pol Pot. So has there been a failure in education with regards to this evil from the far left?
Yes. Short answer, I think, is yes. Where yes, there's dangers from the far right. It's fine to learn about, but it is interesting that we spend so much time on Hitler specifically, because you don't learn that much in schools about Mussolini or Franco or Pinochet or other right-wing dictators. I mean, it's worth knowing, like, okay, well, you have the example of Hitler, but what about these other right-wing dictators? How are they the same and different from Hitler? That would be worth knowing as well. But we just spend so much time on this one person. One reason I think for this is that it's such a simple story. Hitler himself was almost cartoonishly evil with his appearance and his mustache and, ranting and raving at the podium and that kind of thing. He fits the kind of comic book image people have in their minds of what a villain looks like. And then obviously, like, the Holocaust was a horrific event, and it's very easily understood why that would be evil even to a school child. Whereas left-wing massacres, they're harder to, I think, connect the dots. I think most teachers aren't very smart, and so it would be hard for them to even explain how such a kind and noble-sounding ideology could lead to mass graves and mass death. But that is what happened. And so because it's a harder story to tell and a harder story to follow, not only for the students, but probably for a lot of the teachers as well, it just doesn't get taught. It gets completely overlooked. And then, more cynically, it could be the case that, a lot of people who set education policy and educators themselves tend to be left-leaning, and they don't want kids to second guess, why socialism might not be such a great idea.
So this might be a bit outlandish, but it seems to me that we're going through a sort of populist global revolution where you have, here in America, let's say Trump, anti-globalist, Malay, Bukele. They all have different styles and different focuses. Obviously, in Argentina, it's all about the economy. In Salvador, it's all about crime. But we've had it across Europe, and it takes different. But it seems to be, if you're to group them all together, it's a sort of revolt, a revolution against the globalist, elitist, and I would say largely progressive worldview. Are these revolutionaries, if we can call them that, a successful version of those? Like you described, Lenin, who are sort of close to power but not of it. Is there a parallel there?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I guess this is
Trump.
kind of it.
Trump was, a part of the elite. Wasn't president. Was ridiculed for not being president by Obama. We can all remember that. And so was it? I'm close to this, but I'm gonna.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, they were successful in that way, right? Like, they did manage to attain those positions. By actually riding the wave of mass sentiment, of winning popular support. Even the people who point out, that in 2016 Trump didn't win the popular vote. In 2024 he did, and so his support actually increased over time, despite the endless attacks from his political opponents. He still increased his support rather than decreased. So yes, I think that that kind of populism, nationalism, populism, that kind of idea, that's actually appealing to a lot of people. This feeling of, putting your own citizens first and protecting your own country, and I think that resonates with a lot of people, ordinary people, less so for highly educated people who spend a lot of time around people like themselves. People who travel a lot versus people who are born and raised in the place that they, or people who live in the place that they were born and raised. And that's most people. I remember having these conversations with some students at Cambridge years ago. And they all, most of them were first-generation students, and they lamented how their parents didn't like to travel, and they did. And they were in a place now, finally, where they're around people like themselves, open-minded sophisticates. And I had to remind them that, the type of people their parents are, that's most people. Most people don't go to Cambridge. Most people aren't that way of thinking like, oh, I can't wait to see the whole world. And I'm a global citizen, not a citizen of the US or Britain or what have you. And there's a famous headline in the New York Times years ago. It was something like, the average American lives 17 miles from mom. In other words, most people, stay close by to where they grew up, and they have an attachment to that place. And I think that's hard for a lot of, credentialed elites to understand.
Yeah, that's the David Goodhart somewheres and everywheres argument, which totally applies to Britain as well. And you look at the Brexit vote, leave and remain. It really, those people who live near home, grounded in community, have a propensity to vote a certain way, whereas the everywheres, those who go to university in a different city and then take a job in a different country, have a different worldview completely. Rob, we're going to go over to the Substack, behind the Substack paywall.
All right, finally I can speak my mind.
Yeah, exactly. This is where all our guests are extremely racist and get out all their misogyny and so
I brought notes.
So. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to bring viewers and listeners' attention to?
Well, you can follow me on Substack, robkhenderson.com, and you can get a copy of my book Troubled, now out in paperback, wherever you get books.
Yes, wonderful. That's Troubled, and thank you, Rob. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you. I'm going to ask you over on our Substack about your experience meeting Charlie Kirk, if you don't mind, because your very special Twitter X post about it, I think was very touching. So we're going to go over to the Substack. Rob Henderson, a great pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Winston.
Thanks for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Rob Henderson. Head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk right now for that extended conversation with me and Rob, where Rob tells me about his experience meeting Charlie Kirk. But otherwise, thank you for supporting, and until next time, be well.